Fixing the hip thrust for maximum glute growth. And if you're feeling your lower back, your quads, your hamstrings, and no glute in your hip thrust, we're gonna fix that today. I'm John Jewett with J3 University. We elevate physique education. And if you need glutes, whether you're a female, your wellness or bikini, or you're a male bodybuilder, you just need more detail on stage, the hip thrust is a great exercise to implement. And we're gonna show you how to get the most out of it in your training. So when we're looking at really developing the posterior side of the glute, we're primarily looking at the glute maximus, as it's going to have the greatest size difference that we can bring to development. Now we do have the glute minimus and also the glute medius that are underneath the glute and to the side that function mainly to bring that leg outside to the side of the body. But the glute maximus will be our main focal point. Things to know, because people get complicated about like, this is targeting my upper glute, this was my lower glute. But when we look at the glute max, it attaches basically on the back side of the pelvis, not to get too complicated, the sacrum, the coccyx, and the iliac crest. So we're not crossing over necessarily into the lumbar part of the spine. So we shouldn't see the lumbar moving a lot. It's just attaching on the back of your pelvis. Then the insertion point comes down onto the femur, the tuberosity. So we're basically saying that this function of this glute is basically just to move the femur into hip extension, moving it back underneath the body if you're in a squat pattern or you're in an RDL. And since we have one insertion point, pretty much any of those patterns are going to train the entire upper and lower regions of the glute. So we're looking at movements like hip thrusts, squats, and RDLs to really get the big bang for the buck in these patterns that we're utilizing. Now the hip thrust really shines because it relatively can isolate the glute and train it fully in all its fibers. We can look at a study by Delgado in 2019 comparing the hip thrust, the squat, and the RDL. And it had pretty much this very similar activation across all these lifts. However, in the squat, had more activation in the hip and also other knee extensors. So if we really want something that's going to target more of just the glute, probably looking more at hip thrust or even the RDL, well, for this study. Now, we further this, what about actually training? Because that's just activation studies. In 2023, Plotkin et al. Compared 9 weeks of training in the squat versus the hip thrust and elicited very similar glute hypertrophy. However, the squat had greater thigh hypertrophy, which makes complete sense. So some people like only do squats and RDLs for your glutes. Now, well, if you need something that actually is to bring up glutes, that's where the hip thrust really shines. So common mistakes that we're going to see in this lift is the feet being too far forward. That's when you're going to feel a lot of hamstring. Also, if the feet are too far backwards, you're going to create a lot of quad bias and emphasis in this movement. Other issues that we see is overly arching the spine, going into a lot of lumbar extension, and then towards the top, kind of scooping the hips up and like doing kind of this ab crunch at the top of the lift. Now, positioning the pelvis in that way kind of points it out in front of you rather than up towards the wall, where we're trying to drive the hips up into the bar or your hip thrust machine. So what you have happen is that the glutes will still work some, but you might bring in more quad or more adductor to get the job accomplished of hip extension. Now, before I get into the fixes of all this, if you need a program that can prioritize glutes and not have to think about if this is going to work for you or not, at J3 we created the Hourglass Program. It's a 45-page PDF document with also videos accompanying me and Luke Miller, showcasing my wife back here, Wellness Olympian, on how to actually execute the program. It's all built around glute training and even different splits to prioritize if you do need actually a little more quad, need some overall leg, or if you purely want glute. Also, it prioritizes up, and so you know how to progress your lifts and add in volume. So it's much more than just a cookie cutter, here's your glute program. It shows you how to scale your glute training. Now, let's get into fixes for your hip thrust. Now, for the setup, we want the pad or the bar directly across the crease of your hip. For your feet position, we want them slightly wider than shoulder width, and having the toes can be pointed slightly out or even straight ahead. But at the top of the lift, this is the important part, is that the shin angle is a 90 degrees with the floor, or if you're in like an angled hip thrust like you'll see Renee on, 90 degrees with the angle of that plate. This prevents that foot too far forward or too far back, giving more advantage for the hamstrings or the quads. Now, important part for a lot of people where I see the error occur is you need to brace your core. So the spine and pelvis need to move as one unit. You'll see Renee that basically she's just pivoting at the hip and you don't see a lot of movement in her lumbar spine. So what I usually cue people is brace the core like I'm about to punch you in the stomach. Ugh. So flex those abs down, keep that core brace, and then you're purely going to move at the hip. Now, to get up and drive up, I cue drive the hips to the ceiling. Or if you're in a hip thrust that kind of angles backwards, drive them a little bit upwards and back towards the ceiling. Upon lockout, let your knees naturally roll out a little bit as that glute functions in some external rotation and allow you to get the glute fully shortened. As you go back down into hip flexion, allow the feet to roll inward so you have a good balance between big toe pressure and heel pressure. So you're going down and your big toe kind of presses down. Then when you extend the hips up, they kind of roll a little bit to the outside of the feet. That should get you the most out of your glute. Now, what to do with your head? Should I go down? You've seen people that keep their head down or they go up. It really doesn't matter much, but for some people, usually the rest of the spine follows where the head goes. So if you're throwing your head back, some people might arch the lower back, and that's what we don't want. So I said, just keep a neutral spine so you can keep that brace of the core. That is the simple cueing tips to get the most out of your hip thrust and not have your lower back, your quads, or your hamstrings come into that lift. Now, some programming notes around this. If you really want to prioritize glute, hip thrust, since it really is a core exercise for building the glute max, I would start one glute session absolutely with this at the beginning of your session. And what you'll easily see throughout the week of a glute specific program is 12 sets of purely glute hip thrust work easily being done. So on our other training days, if you have say 3 glute days per week, you might have a squat one day and an RDL on the other day, as these are also excellent glute exercises. And your hip thrust could be as a secondary movement or even later in the session. So that way, if you had this 12 sets, you could be doing 4 sets across 3 days of the week. This is also how we kind of build it into our Hourglass program. So use these tips, stop letting your hip thrust turn into a back, quad, or a hamstring exercise. Get the most out of your glute training. If you want to learn more and implement a program that we've had real world results with, check out our Hourglass Training Program, and I will talk to you next time.